الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنة يوم الدين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In our previous class, we looked at some aspects of the Qur'an being the basic source of legislation during the era of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We looked at the something of the method in which the Quran expressed its laws, and we pointed out that many of the verses began with yas'alunak, they ask you. So there were responses to questions which were given. Or there may have been the responses to situations which arose in Prophet Muhammad's time. And incidents which may have occurred, which required ruling, revelation came accordingly. And we gave a number of examples for that. Then we looked at the general content of the Quran, looking at the Meccan and Medinan period, that it was natural that there would be a difference between the content of the Quran in these two periods. And we looked at the various topics which were covered. The basic difference we spoke about was that of the fact that in the Meccan period, Muslims were an oppressed minority, didn't have power, so the focus was on spiritual development. In any case, that was necessary to establish the foundation for the future of Islam, the Islam which would be spread by that generation to the world. The second half of the Prophet Muhammad's apostleship was characterized by the revelation of a variety of societal laws which would govern the society and its needs, whether it's inheritance laws, trade laws, etc., etc. Then we looked at the various fields of study where the Quranic content was divided into three aspects. One which dealt with information concerning belief in Allah and His angels, etc., which we know as theology or al-aqidah. The second area being that of reformation of human character, and we refer to that as ilm al-akhlaq or ethics. And the third area had to do with social laws which were necessary to govern human society and the societal needs. Then we divided the legal content of the Quran itself into two categories. One which dealt with the relationship between man and Allah, and that was manifest in terms of the various religious rites, etc. And they had subdivisions. And the other ones dealt with human interaction, human beings dealing with other human beings. And we had a series of laws which were enacted to deal with that, whether they're criminal laws, laws concerning trade, laws concerning family, divorce, marriage, etc., and laws concerning the promotion of and the laws concerning the promotion and propagation of Islam. That was the fourth category. Now we're going to be looking at the basis of legislation in the Quran. Now we're going to be looking at the basis of legislation in the Quran itself. The basic principle which has been identified is that Islam did not come to erase whatever human beings were involved in and replace it with a whole new set of laws, etc., etc. It basically came to reform. It was a reformation. The other approach would be cancellation, where you just cancel all that was there. You say all of it has no benefit, it's all corrupt, it's all misguided, pagan, etc. Much of it was. So it all needs to be cancelled. We have something completely new from A to Z. This wasn't the approach of the Islamic legislation. What it did was it reformed. It cancelled certain things which were clearly harmful to the society. Where they couldn't identify, no good element could be identified which would outweigh the evil of it. So it was cancelled outright. Example of that is alcohol, its sale and etc. So what basically Islamic law recognizes is that human beings, no matter where they are in the world, they do have something to contribute which is positive. That it is natural for them to try to seek what is best, what is beneficial in the society. They may be successful in doing it or they may not be. Also, we have to recognize that the laws of Allah were propagated around the world in prior times, prior to the coming of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So remnants of the previous laws would also be found in Arabian society and in world societies, where people had made some choices which we see actually agree with Islamic laws because of the fact that their origins were in Islamic law. And that is why when we look at the Quranic instructions concerning prohibitions and commands, that Allah says that the Qur'an يَأْمُرُهُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, that the Qur'an commands people to do righteousness. That's how it's translated. But actually, what is there in the text is al-ma'ruf. If you go back to the dictionary, you would then question what happened to the translator. Because ma'ruf comes from ma'arifa, which means to know, right? Al-ma'ruf is what they call passive participle, meaning that which is known. So the Quran commands them with or to do that which is known. So what is this? What does that mean? That which is known to be good. That is the command, to do what is known to be good everywhere. Islam is not commanding some new good which nobody ever knew about, never heard about. It's, which has no basis in history of human societies. No. What it commands is to do what is known to be good, as well as some things which people didn't know. It also commands or prohibits us from doing what is known to be evil. And that's what it's called al-munkar. Munkar is that which is rejected, from nakira, which means to reject. So that which is rejected. Rejected what? By how? Rejected by human nature, rejected by human societies internationally, all around the world. There are certain acts which society has naturally objected. Of course, what happens is that when people decide to determine what is acceptable and what is not by votes, right? And, what has been inherited over the generations is completely rejected, then you may find these values changing, where people may now consider what is a well-known good as an evil, and what was a well-known evil as a good. Right? Classical case of that is homosexuality today. Homosexuality today. This has been hated, despised, looked down upon by societies throughout the world. Not to say that you didn't find, individual cases in different societies, where people develop this pattern for one reason or another. And we know Sodom and Gomorrah, the Prophet Lot, that spread in his people. But in general around the world, it was rejected. However, in our times, we have a culture globalizing respect, honor, etc. for this heinous practice. Right? So values have been twisted now, and this is coming through education, etc., or we could call it miseducation. So basically we say Islam is fundamentally a system of building and not one of destruction, as its goal is reformation and not merely control and government. It should also be noted at this point that Islam's confirmation of some Arab customs does not mean that it has taken its laws and principles from other sources, because this is one of the things the modernists like to promote, right? That the hijab is really from Persia and this and that, whatever, trying to give the impression that, these were Arabian customs which were prevalent in Arabia at the time, came from other civilizations, etc., and they were absorbed in, right? That they're really not part of the revelation, and that's why it's not really compulsory on women to really wear hijab. These are the kind of arguments they use. It's an Arab cultural thing, But the reality is that when Islam adopted or accepted certain practices which were common among the Arabs at that time, what it really was considering is that it had already an origin in Revelation, because the use of hijab you can find in the Mosaic law in Jesus' time, etc. The hijab was in force, in practice. So it was already, this was a remnant coming down from the time of Prophet Ismail, right, who in his generation would have taught it, and it came down to modern times. And otherwise, it may be something which, were it not present, Islamic law would have instituted it. Right? So things which are adopted, right, from Arabic culture, either they were things inherited from earlier generations which were good, left over from the messages of the prophets, or they were logical and reasonable principles, made sense, or they were principles which would have been enacted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if they were not already present in the society. But having said that, reality in terms of what Islamic law confirmed of the Arab practices, in fact, were very few. Very, very few. What was cancelled was many. What was cancelled was far more than what was confirmed. And even that which was confirmed was not confirmed in its existing form. Like the hijab which the women wore was hijab which went to the back. It was more like a scarf which went to the back. And the chest area was exposed. So the Qur'an said, come and said, take your hijab, your headscarves, and put it over your bosoms. So it corrected it. So it didn't accept it in the existing form. Hajj, for example, which was in existence when Prophet received his message, it was in practice there. But what they were doing in Hajj, was all kinds of, unacceptable things. Instead of wearing ihram and walking around the Kaaba, people were walking around the Kaaba stark naked. Right? They're going back. I mean, from Islamic principle, it is sort of like the way you come in the world. Initially, after you come in, they wrap you up. Okay, so we have a wrap. Right? Whereas their idea was, we're coming before God, as He created us. So they're walking around the Kaaba, as they say, buck naked, So Islam came and said, no, right? Also, when they slaughtered the animals, they were throwing the blood against the wall of the Kaaba. So no. We slaughter the animal, in commemoration of Prophet Ibrahim's slaughter, but we don't need to be throwing the blood, against the wall of the Kaaba. What is the use of that? They felt that in doing that, because the Kaaba is dedicated to God, they're saying, okay, here's the blood, right? But as Allah said in the Qur'an, it is not the blood and the meat that reaches God. It is your piety, your righteousness in doing the act that you did. So that was cancelled, and so on and so forth, through a number of the different practices which were confirmed by Islamic law and modified. Now we're going to look at basic considerations, four basic considerations when the Quranic laws were enacted. There are four guiding principles. From these guiding principles, we could say this is from Maqasid al-Sharia, or the goals of the Sharia. I mean, what was the principle, what was the idea behind it? When Allah enacted these laws, there was an idea, a concept behind it. I mean, He didn't necessarily say openly, these are the four principles. Scholars, in looking at and analyzing the laws and how they came and what the Prophet ﷺ said about it and what Allah said about it, etc., they deduce these four principles. The first one is the removal of difficulty. Removal of difficulty. So, Islam, the way of life of Islam, cannot be looked at as a burden. See, again, this is something where people think, you have to pray 5 times a day, you have to fast in Ramadan, all of these are like burdens that you're putting on yourself, right? In Christian tradition, where people tortured themselves, they wrapped themselves in woolen garments and went out into the desert and suffered, the heat, or lived in a well for 10 years or top of a mountain for 20 years. This was like torture. I mean, that's their worship, their quest for God was a torturous one. So from that, there was a rebellion. The Renaissance was a rebellion against that way. Going back to what is more natural, humane, etc., etc. And this is where the marriage of priests, with the Reformation, the Protestant movement, priests could now marry. They were, they didn't have these torturous circumstances that they were to be put under. So you could say the Western psyche has this impression of religion, and especially when it comes to Islam, after they have turned religion into something so loose, so free, so minimalized, that the idea that you're going to go and say, you have to pray 5 times a day, you have to fast in Ramadan, you have to give this money, you have to Hajj, torturous, all of this then is looked at as burdens. But fact of the matter is that they're not. In fact, all of these principles which Islam has enacted, all have been there to make easy for human beings life in this world. To make the way for human beings life in this world, their life in this world. Okay, first question. How does praying 5 times a day make life easier? Having to get up for Fajr at 3:30, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, night. How does it make life easier?
It helps us to concentrate. It helps us in improving our concentration.
It helps in our concentration. Well, maybe to some degree. You see, the point is that we have to look at what is the goal. The goal of worship, 5 times daily prayer, is to be conscious of God. That is the goal. For a person to be successful in this life, he or she must be conscious of God. Successful in the real sense. Because of course, if people look at the success as being just money, then it means I needed my extra sleep so I could work extra harder to make extra more money. So that's breaking my sleep, so I'm losing out some money here. That's how it may be looked at. But if we look at success ultimately as going beyond just the material, then 5 times daily prayer links the believer with God, makes the remembrance of God easier, because if you're not required to pray to God daily, then who's going to remember? Life is so busy, we've got so many other distractions, so many other obligations, etc., etc. Who's going to remember? And of course, you ask the average Christian, he only prays on Sunday. The rest of the week he's busy, Enjoy on Saturday, and you pray on Sunday, and the rest of the week you're busy. Nose to the grindstone, So, what kind of lifestyle? Where's the consciousness of God in it? So, 5 times daily prayer, though it might seem hard for a person who's not doing it, at the same time, if we understand that remembrance of God is critical for success in this life, then it makes it easier. Okay, what about fasting? Again, you deprive yourself of water and drink for 30 days in a year. How does that make life easier? That's just making life more difficult. How?
It makes us feel how others who don't have the food and how they feel, and it brings us closer to Allah as well. Because Allah had mentioned that the fasting is only for Him. It softens our heart.
Okay, the issue of reminding us of Allah, okay, that element is there already. But if we consider in terms of fasting, we are abstaining. We are giving up. What are we giving up? Haram.
Being thankful, content.
No. Follow me here, please. What are we giving up in Ramadan? Are we giving up haram? They are halal things. We're giving up halal things. Right? So, isn't that making life more difficult? How does it make life easier? It's enough that we're forbidding the haram things. But now here in 1 month we're now forbidding the halal things.
By giving up these halal things, it brings us closer to Allah.
No, we're closer to Allah already. In the first principle. What other principle is here? Well, look at it this way.
It's just self-control.
Self-control. I mean, what we're talking about here is that if we are giving up the halal, right, this should make it easier for us outside of Ramadan to give up the haram. If we are voluntarily here giving up the halal, that is training. Giving up what is normally halal to us. This is training for us to make the giving up of the haram easier. And success in the life, again, depends on giving up what is haram. Right? It makes success in this life will depend on our ability to give up the haram. If we can't give up the haram, then we'll fail. Isn't it? So that helps us by putting us through that period of training where we give up what is halal, but not absolutely. I mean, we do it through daylight hours and we allowed it after. But daylight hours, at least some training is there to make giving up the haram easier. Zakah, taking out some of our money and giving it away. How does that make this life easier?
Cleanse our wisdom.
Oh, okay, purifies what Allah has given us. Yes, but we have to look at what is the main principle which comes out of zakah. It is developing a sense of generosity. Generosity meaning that you can be thankful to Allah for what He has given you and share it with others. So again, being thankful, gratitude is essential for effectively surviving in this life, because our life is always between trials of success and failure. What tends to happen is that when we fail, why me? God, why did you do this to me? I don't deserve this. These are the type of statements that you hear people make. They cannot recognize in difficulty that they should still be grateful to Allah. So when people experience these kinds of trials, then it leads them into doing haram as a result. So the point is that the principles of Islam, the pillars of Islam, though they may be looked at from one perspective as an element of difficulty you're adding to your life, when we look at the big picture, really, they're making this life easier. They're making this life easier. And when we look into the various Islamic laws which have been enacted, we can find Allah repeating time and time again throughout the Qur'an, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Allah doesn't burden a soul more than it can bear. Yuridullahu bikum al-yusra wa la yuridu bikum al-usra. Allah wishes for you ease, He does not wish difficulty for you. And so on and so forth. Number of verses in the Qur'an which address this point. Allah wishes ease. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had made similar statements, Yassiru wa la tu'assiru, make things easy for people, don't make it difficult. When he sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal and others to go and govern Yemen, he advised them to make things easy for people and not difficult. And we look at, in general, the various laws which Allah has enacted with a variety of concessions in them. We find the laws are not fixed without allowing for times of difficulty when you can't, etc. So we have shortening of prayers, joining of prayers. Though it's 5 times a day, still you can reduce it to 3 times a day when you're traveling. Right? It's shortened from 4 to 2 rakat. We also have where your life is threatened, you can eat pork, You can drink alcohol. These concessions are there. You know. Where others might say, well, what? If it's forbidden, you shouldn't need to take it at all, anytime. No. Islam recognizes that preservation of life takes precedence over protection of the society from the harm of a particular substance. If that substance will protect the person's life, the individual's life at that particular time, then it becomes permissible for them to the degree that is necessary to protect their life and preserve it. One point we should note here is that some people, under the general banner of make it easy for people, don't make it difficult, they may flip around from school of law to school of law, finding the concessions. Wherever we find a scholar who says, oh, it's okay, that's it. So this process of what we call fatwa shopping is justified under the heading of making things easier. So wherever you find in a school of Islamic law or in the rulings of a scholar ease, take it. But this is not the correct approach, because the correct approach is to try to follow Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as closely as possible. So our decision to take a particular ruling as opposed to another ruling should not be based on whether this one's easier for me or not, but whether it is more authentic or it's more supported by evidence or not. I'm more convinced that this is correct than that. That should be the foundation, and not what is most easy for me. The second principle is the reduction of religious obligations. The reduction of religious obligations. But one might say, no, looking at Christianity and looking at Islam, religious obligations are more in Islam than in Christianity. Well, because Christianity is not a religion anymore. It wasn't the religion which Jesus brought. May God's peace and blessing be upon him. Islam, its laws are a reduction with regards to the Mosaic laws, which Jesus affirmed and added to, etc. There is reduction there. Things have been made easier. But relative to what is known of Christianity today, where all the laws have been cancelled and people just basically do as you please, then of course, that's the wrong perspective to look at it from. And the legal system of Islam, as we can see it, is a reflection of Adam in the garden. Back to Adam in the garden. It's the same thing. All the trees are permissible, one tree forbidden. You can't get any less than that. After that, then everything is permissible. Right? Islam prohibits the one tree. So what you find, if you want to tell people about the permissible trees and the forbidden trees in a given garden, then you don't need to say the pear trees, the apple trees, the fig trees, the grapefruit trees, all these trees, and you have to name each and every tree to say, okay, these are all permissible. But the one tree, the marijuana tree, this is the forbidden one. Right? Right? You don't need to say that. All you have to say is, the marijuana tree is forbidden, everything else is permissible. So that is reduction of obligations to a minimum. So in that case, when you are explaining the law, you only have to describe in detail the forbidden. But what is permissible, you just say everything beyond that is permissible. And that's what you see consistently throughout the Qur'an when Allah describes the forbidden things and the permissible things. For example, with regards to marriage, you will find Allah saying, prohibited to you are your mothers, your daughters, your sisters, your aunts, your all of these listed. And then at the end of it all, Allah then says, except for these, all others are lawful, provided you seek them in marriage with a dowry and not fornication. So what is permissible is just expressed in general. Everything else beyond these. Whereas the forbidden things are specifically mentioned. Similarly, in the foods we eat, you find the verses saying, forbidden to you for food are animals which die of themselves, pork, blood, animals slaughtered in the name of others besides Allah, animals killed by strangulation, by a blow, by falling, by being gored, etc., etc., etc. And then at the end of it all, then everything else beyond that is permissible. And this we see, as a consistent pattern in the legislation, where reduction, we find religious obligations are consistently reduced. We also find, as an example, even when we end up with the forbidden things which have been identified, as we said earlier, a person who is forced to take these things is not considered sinful. So the sin has been lifted from the person, right? Forced into that circumstance. So again, that is a reduction. It could have remained sinful, you did it to survive, okay, but the sin is on you. But Allah removes the sin from the person. Also what we find is laws which have been enacted in the Qur'an don't contain a lot of details. They leave some leeway for human circumstances and situations. The Prophet ﷺ did provide certain additional details in terms of how, but left certain issues to human beings and their abilities or their needs. And what we find, there's a famous verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 101, where Allah says, O you who believe, do not ask about things which if made plain for you will cause you trouble. O you who believe, do not ask about things if made plain for you will cause you trouble. These are things, meaning you're asking about things which have not been defined, which have been deliberately left general. So you have a certain element of leeway there. Not things which the Prophet ﷺ went and defined, clarified. They don't mean this. So they are being advised. You don't need to go into the depths. So for example, it's the same thing. If you go, practically speaking, you go to the West. You're in a country where people are Christians in name. They're Christians. And we're allowed to eat the food of the Christians. So, what do? Well, pork you can't eat, understood. But other than that, that which is not clearly forbidden in Islamic law, the other things, then you eat without going into asking the person when you're going to the restaurant. You have to go into the kitchen in the back and say, what kind of oil are you using, and this, and do you mix this one when you cook pork, and do you use the same fork or the same knife to cut the pork as you use to cut the... Oh, you can do that. I'm not saying you can't do it. You can do that, and you can make life very difficult. Every time you go out, you want to eat, you have to be checking all these. And some people have made a business out of it. You know, they have books where they've gone and they've got all these numbers, and you know, if you have this L number or C2145, this is in your food and it's from this source and that source, they have huge long lists. So it's in your toothpaste, it's in a this and it's in a that, and so when you really look around, you find it's very few things you could actually consume. They've gone into details and details beyond what the Sharia even requires. So where the Sharia recognizes, for example, that when you have a circumstance of vast halal material and a little bit of haram falls in it, that little haram or najis doesn't defile the whole. We know this. A little bit of najis doesn't defile the whole. There's a pond. Somebody across the other side of the pond is there urinating in the pond. Is the water now defiled? Can you still make wudu from that pond or not? Yes, you can. Even if he defecated in the pond, it doesn't change the validity of using the water of that pond. As long as, the principle they say, as long as the color hasn't changed, the smell hasn't changed, right? And the taste hasn't changed, still tasting like water, then it's okay, right? And that's why we don't have a problem with recycled water. Of course, people psychologically, they may have problems with it, and that's why it's not used here, for example, in Qatar. It's not used. Recycled water is not used for drinking. Recycled water may be used for watering the plants. You know, they put it through the processes. And because they're going to use it to water the plants, they don't have to put it all the way through. They just put it enough through so it's relatively clean. Right? But it might have smell and other things, right? So they use it for sprinkling and watering the grass and these type of things. But they only use pure water, whether it's from the well or desalinated from the sea, for drinking. And that is a personal preference. And I remember a couple of years back, you know, when in Australia this issue came up because the amount of water, they were having a scarcity of water, they had to look at some alternative approaches to water. You know, because in Australia traditionally too, they were just desalinating and using the rivers. You know, the idea of using recycled water, they didn't really like this idea either. So they had to put it to a vote and explain to the people what the situation was, and the other people accepted it. Anyway, but the point is that going into all of these numbers, if you find in the substance that you're going to eat, you know, it has this number, which number represents a few molecules of what may be najasa or haram. In a quantity of stuff that you're using, it is negligible. It is negligible. It doesn't count. It has no value. So those books that are out on the market, they've been produced, you can go to websites where they list all of these numbers. It is a waste of time. It is people digging into things that they really didn't need to dig into. It's not necessary. So Islam, you know, tells us basically to take things easy. If the evidence comes to you, it's presented to you, clearly this thing is not permissible, then you leave it. But when Prophet Muhammad was offered a bowl of meat soup in Medina, he didn't question, by a Jewess, she gave him, he didn't question, how did you slaughter this animal? You know, did you put it on its side? Did you say Bismillah? Did you give it? She's a Jew. She offered food. He ate it.
Any questions or opportunities you take?
No, I mean, even when we don't have an example specifically of Christians offering him. We just have that of the Jews. But the Sahaba, you know, in describing how they handle things in Christian areas, they took it in the same light and in the same way. Prophet Muhammad basically in his Sunnah encouraged people to avoid unnecessary digging and prying and questioning too. There was a man on one occasion who asked him whether Hajj was compulsory for every year. Prophet ignored him. And he asked it again. And he ignored him. And he asked it again. And finally, he said, if I said yes, it would have become compulsory. Leave me alone concerning things that I have left up to you. For certainly those before you were destroyed because of their many unnecessary questions and their arguments and disagreements with their prophets. If the Prophet ﷺ left it open, then no need to pry in and create problems for ourselves. In another narration, the Prophet ﷺ said, if I have prohibited you from doing something, avoid it totally. But if I have commanded you to do something, do as much of it as you can. Do as much of it as you can. Right? So when the Prophet ﷺ said, pray as you saw me pray, that's a command. We do as much as we can. As much as we can to do it the way he did, we try to. But there are going to be elements which we may not be able to do. May not be able to sit in iftirash, with your right leg propped up and your left leg under your behind. This for some people the knees may not bend like that. You can't sit like that. So you do what is closest to it. It doesn't affect the validity of your prayer, because you just are required to do as much as you can. Also, when we look at the business transactions, we find that in the Quranic rulings regarding business transactions, they tend to be general, free of a lot of details. And we find Allah saying, for example, O you who believe, fulfill your contracts. Allah has made trade halal and prohibited interest. O you who believe, do not eat up your properties amongst yourselves unfairly. And there should be trade by mutual goodwill. He's left general principles. So, the realm of trade, business transactions, is quite wide. Of course, the Sunnah came and gave some details. Not to say, simply because the Qur'an has left things open, we don't need to know what the Sunnah had to say on them. No, we do. We utilize what the Prophet ﷺ has given us to give us that clarity in those areas where the clarity is necessary. Otherwise, what the Prophet ﷺ left, what the Qur'an has left open in terms of trade, etc., then we continue utilizing or benefiting from the generalities of the Quranic and Hadithic texts. The third basic principle is that of realization of public welfare. Realization of public welfare. We can say in general that when you hear the Prophet ﷺ saying, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying that the evil in alcohol is greater than the good. See, here is our principle of general welfare. The good to the society as a whole is minimized. It's mainly harmful to the society as a whole, but it's good for some individuals. And you'll see that consistently with the various forbidden foods, actions, etc. For the most part, they are harmful to the society as a whole. I mean, there's some things like pork, this is an individual harm. But for the most part, the prohibited transactions and foods, etc., mainly in terms of transactions, because this is interhuman relationships, we find that they prohibit for the sake of the general welfare. So as people will argue with us about interest in banks, that people benefit from this interest. You put your money in the bank and you get extra money out. What's so bad about that? That's what they'll say. What's so bad about that? But the point is that the harm which comes from that process, yes, the individuals who have capital, have means, they benefit. Their money is loaned and they get more money on top of it. But the vast majority of people in the society are not in that category. The vast majority end up suffering as a result. They suffer. And that is why Islam has banned it. And here, in terms of public welfare, we find that Prophet Muhammad is described as being sent to all of mankind. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا كَافَّةً لِلنَّاسِ. We have not sent you but for the generality of humankind. So, what is the general need? The general need of humans is addressed by the Prophet ﷺ in his various laws which he has enacted and is commanded, which add additional depth and breadth to the Quranic laws. One of the evidences of this concern for human welfare can be seen in the principle of nasakh, which governs Islamic law, that there are abrogation of laws, replacement with other laws. Some people say, well, no, you can't have nasakh. If Allah made something not allowed or made something, prohibited, why are you going to change this? Well, what you find is that where there is change does not address primary truths. Allah doesn't say in one place, worship God alone, and then later on you can worship a few others along with God, and then others you can worship others besides God. There's nothing like that, because if in the end Allah is saying you can worship others besides God, and then in the beginning He said you can worship God, either you shouldn't worship others besides God or you shouldn't. You can't have a gradation or gradual rulings regarding it, because either this is like black and white. Either it is right to worship God alone or it's not. So in those kind of areas, then there's no grading in the legal system. But in areas where something may be temporarily suspended because the people were not ready to deal with it at that time, and gradually allowed or gradually made prohibited, such things deal with the societal need, helping them gradually to fulfill what Allah wished for them, without coming on harshly as a destructive force, as we said before, where you just wipe out everything that's there. But doing it gradually, we find that people are brought into a situation which they may not have been comfortable with before or familiar with before. So we find, for example, in the case of the bequest, the wasiyah, where in pre-Islamic Arab culture, property of the deceased was inherited by his children, right? Mainly males. And parents had nothing to get. Nothing was given to parents. Islamic law initially made it a requirement that when one is leaving a will, some should be set aside for parents. So it's gradually teaching people the importance of parents and looking after parents, etc. Then later on, the verses came which specify the amounts which were for each and every member of the family, including parents. Everything was now specified. But initially, it was an instruction to make a bequest. So Allah said, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, it is prescribed that when death approaches any of you, if he leaves behind any goods, that he should make a bequest to parents and next of kin, according to what is reasonable. This is due from the pious. Right? After the Quranic laws were revealed, identifying the rights of each and every person, then the Prophet ﷺ added a cap on it. That whoever's inheritance has already been specified, you cannot leave a will for that person. End of story. So Prophet ﷺ said, surely Allah has given everyone with a right to inheritance his right. So there should be no bequest for inheritors. So the bequest was kept. It wasn't nullified, but it was kept now to look after those people who were not specifically prescribed by Allah. Those people which Allah specifically prescribed are your close relatives. Those who are not prescribed are your distant relatives, friends, neighbors, whatever. These are the people who are not prescribed. So there you are left with leeway. On one hand, you have an obligation to your family. You're dying, you're leaving this world. But you leave them, your means, what you've earned, you're part of that family. It's their right to benefit from what you have left. You don't have the right to deprive them. So they are obliged to share what they have with their immediate family, who they were responsible for, or who were responsible for them. But then there may be people outside of that group who were even more helpful, who were more supportive, etc. You are then allowed to give something to them, up to 1/3 of your inheritance. And this includes even non-Muslims. Because this is an issue. Yes, Prophet ﷺ had said, the non-Muslim should not inherit from the Muslim, nor should the Muslim inherit from the non-Muslim. Pause for the adhan. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu rasulullah. We were looking at the third principle, the realization of public welfare. And we mentioned that abrogation in Islamic law allowed for human need at different points in time. We talked about issues of recognizing, Islamic law recognizing some elements of Arab culture and introducing the laws of inheritance as an example in stages. In the first stage, the will had to include parents who normally had no right. In the second stage, rights to parents was established, and then the writing of the will was left only for those who would not normally inherit. I added at the end is that a common misconception held concerning inheritance laws is that the Prophet ﷺ said the disbeliever cannot inherit from the believer. لا يرث المسلم الكافر ولا يرث الكافر المسلم. Muslim should not inherit from the disbeliever, nor should the disbeliever inherit from the Muslim. This is authentic hadith. And this meant absolutely. But inherit here, la yarith. In a wirasa, this is in accordance with inheritance laws. Meaning that if you have a non-Muslim parent and they die in a non-Muslim country without writing a will for you, then the law system has its own inheritance laws by which it divides up the wealth and offers you a portion. You are not to take it. Not to take it. If you're a non-Muslim parent or relative, whatever, their wealth is divided according to the laws of the inheritance laws of the country, kafir or pagan inheritance laws, then you're not allowed to take that inheritance. But if they wrote a will for you, right, that is considered wasiyah. And the wasiyah you can take, as you can give. You can give up to 1/3 of your wealth to a non-Muslim friend. Possible. Because this is not considered to be inheritance. It is a gift. Just as if you are living, can you give some of your money to a non-Muslim? Yes. After you die, you can do the same. So, this is the correct understanding with regards to that hadith, well-known hadith. Also, we find in terms of the mourning period for women who died, initially it was a whole year that the women had to remain in a state of mourning. But then it was reduced to 4 months and 10 days. And also the requirements of the dress and all this kind of thing, staying in the home, etc., these were relaxed. Similarly, with the laws concerning fornication, homosexuality, etc., these laws were initially lock the person in the home, punish them in their homes until they repent. Right? Later, it was changed to specific punishments for adultery, fornication, etc., etc. So that element of abrogation, gradual rulings took into account human need and welfare. In another way in which the human welfare was considered during or after the era of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it can be found in the fact that Islamic law identifies reasons. In many cases, Allah says, identifies the reasons for the enactment of the laws. Take charity from your wealth to purify them and make them grow, and also let your wealth not remain as the property of a few amongst you, that it circulates. Satan's plan is to incite enmity and hatred between you with intoxicants and gambling, and prevent you from remembrance of Allah and from prayer. So these are the principles that have been identified. So by giving rationale behind laws, then it gave human beings a chance to apply those laws according to the causes for those laws. Similarly, Prophet ﷺ had said, for example, I forbade you from visiting graveyards, however, permission has been given to me to visit the grave of my mother, so visit them, for they remind you of the next life. The Prophet ﷺ also giving reasons behind. So from that, scholars extracted a principle that the presence or absence of laws could be indicated by or are indicated by the reasons behind them. So where a reason is present, the law is required. Where the reason is not present, the law is not required. And that's why Umar ibn al-Khattab, for example, made the ruling in his time that mu'allafat al-qulub, the category of giving zakah, some zakat to those people who were near to Islam, to win them over to Islam, he suspended it, explaining that in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when Muslims were fewer and non-Muslims were a greater number, to win them over to Islam, it was a useful principle then. But once Islam became now strength and the dominant force in the peninsula, etc., then to win them over within the peninsula was no longer necessary. But it didn't mean this is forever, because as Islam spread, it would enter into other situations where encouraging the majority again to come becomes useful, so you can enact in those circumstances. But in circumstances where Islam is strong, there is no need, people are coming into Islam anyway, no need to spend in that area. We use that category, spend for other areas or in other elements of the various elements in which zakah is distributed. Also, consideration of human welfare can be seen in the methodology of legislation. In the case of laws wherein human benefit will not change with time or conditions, Allah has spelled out the details clearly. Laws which will not change, human conditions not change, it deals with human nature. So the law stands. So family laws, in terms of marriage, divorce, etc., inheritance, and laws which deal with certain crimes, stealing, etc., stand, right? Whereas other laws which have to do with business transactions and these types of things, there's more leeway there and less details are spelled out, because different systems and practices may develop in other areas which allow for other practices which may not have been common in Arabia to be implemented, as long as they don't break the basic principles of deception and these types of things. Similarly, for example, this is what you have to consider, where Islamic law, according to Prophet the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah curses the man who dresses like a woman and the woman who dresses like a man. So this is a general principle. However, in a society where it is common for men to wear skirts, like Scotland or Yemen, right? Scotland and Yemen, men commonly wear skirts, right? So in that society, wearing a skirt, which would in other society be considered dressing like a woman, is not implemented. It's not forbidden. So the principle has been explained that what is forbidden is not the dress itself per se, but it is the looking like a woman. So in a society where we have a norm where this is not considered to be feminine, then you don't apply that principle there. You will not apply it there. But you will apply what is known in that society to be feminine, then that's only what you would say would be forbidden for men. Okay, inshallah we're going to stop here. The last principle, the realization of the universal justice, we'll look at that in our coming class. Okay.
Principle. But doesn't that mean that if we change the society, we'll have to change the laws?
Okay, brother's question, that if we have leeway in interpreting this principle of dress, then where society changes, the laws may have to change also. Well, to some degree, that's true. To some degree, that may be true. That something years back may have been considered typically feminine, but in the course of time, it is no longer associated with femininity. And if that association is gone, then the law would not be applied to that particular thing which years back was considered to be unacceptable. And this happens to some degree with globalization of cultures, where people are exposed to other people's cultures and they adopt these things and they become popular and become widespread. I mean, we have that principle still alive, but of course there are limitations on it. There are limitations on it. I mean, limitations meaning where we see that the fashion industry, controlled by homosexuals for the most part, right? The leading fashion designers, whether French, Italian, whatever, they're homosexuals. Virtually every last one of them. And we see them deliberately making designs which become, as they say, unisex, where they are deliberately trying to blur the lines between male and female. That's the women will be given tuxedos and dresses and brogue shoes and and the men are given flowery, blousy, things. We see this as a deliberate attempt, and that's where we have to stand firm. Because we see an insidious practice developing here. As opposed to a given society, for example, where wearing a skirt, as we gave the example, was uncommon, but a lot of Yemenis migrated into this area. And they came with their, izar to their knees, which in the society looked like skirts. But a large enough number of them came, the society saw this as another culture, and it became acceptable. Right? And so some people among the society also began to do it. So something where it happens in that way, that is acceptable. But where it is something planned, you can see somebody is behind the scenes manipulating and deliberately turning, that's where you have to stand firm. So you make a distinction between that which came from the natural globalization of cultures, that the world gets smaller, people are exposed to other cultures, etc., And the other one where it's the fashion industry deliberately blurring these lines and making men just like women. That's where we stand.
On the same issue that you raised, can the izar that the Yemenis wear, can that be considered a skirt? It was a skin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Well, okay, brothers say, can the izar of the Yemenis, that is an izar worn to the knee, basically, right? Can we consider this a skirt when that was the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? I have to raise the question. Was the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to wear his izar to his knee? It was to wear it halfway down the shin. To raise it halfway down the shin. That was what the sunnah was. Because when you wear it to your knee and you sit, what's going to happen? Part of your thigh is going to be exposed. And that's what happens in Yemen.
The Yemenis, they wear it down to the shin.
Well, some Yemenis wear down to the shin. Maybe the north and the south are a difference, but the Yemenis I knew in Medina, they were wearing it commonly to their knees. That was the common practice. Anyway, I'm just giving an example anyway. The point is that, of course, if it is a question of sunnah, which died out and people reviving the sunnah, well, that's a whole other issue. Right?
I have a question concerning the issue of giving inheritance to non-Muslims. What if they use it to promote their Bible religion, or they use it against us?
No, the point is that the issue of giving inheritance to non-Muslims. Brother's question, what if they use it against Islam? The issue here is not, I mean, you as a Muslim who wants to give some inheritance to a non-Muslim, are you going to give it to a person who you know is working against Islam? No. You're giving it to somebody who is a good person, who respected your religion, and so on and so on. So that's what you're giving it to show, as a show of kindness. You know? Repaying their kindness with kindness. So we're not talking about, people just blindly giving away. And of course, Islamically you shouldn't do that. If you know this person is a missionary working hard against Islam, no matter how nice he was, don't give him any money.
No.
Don't give him any money, right? That's, you respect this kindness, thank you very much, Jazakumullah khair, you're a nice man, but don't give him any money, because he's working, day and night against Islam. So, yeah, just those people who are obviously, with a good heart, who can respect Islam, etc., who are not open enemies, Inshallah we close. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب